Hey everyone, my name is Angel Munoz, and today we're going to speak about one of the most influential figures in the Fourth Crusade, Enrico Dandolo. Now, before we get into this, I just want to say we're not going to focus a lot on the military engagements or a lot of the more exciting parts about the Crusade, but I do want to talk about a lot of the circumstances and decisions that just led the Crusade to unfold the way that it did, at least from my understanding of it. And to do that, we're going to speak about Enrico Dandolo. He was born around 1107 and became the 41st Doge of Venice on June 1st, 1191. His actions led to a great expansion of Venetian power and influence, and he was known for his blindness, piety, and shrewdness. Now, one thing of note is that he didn't have cataracts. There's a lot of records saying that he had clear blue eyes, but he was still blind as a bat, and it can be most likely attributed to a head injury he sustained earlier than that. Now, before we get into the Fourth Crusade, we're going to talk about the Byzantine-Venetian relations that were souring at the time before the Crusade. Now, before the Crusade, before Enrico was the Doge of Venice, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus imprisoned thousands of Venetians in the empire. And this led to a massive public outcry from the Venetians, and they wanted the current Doge Vitale II to declare war on the Byzantine Empire. This led to the 1171 Byzantine-Venetian War, and it did not go off Venice. The Doge came back to Venice. He was humiliated, but when he came back, he was met by an angry mob, and he was killed by one of those members in the mob. So this led to lots of reforms in Venice, and eventually Dandolo was able to get reparations from the Byzantine Empire. He was able to get the release of the prisoners in 1183. But this is a state of affairs that the Venetians and the Byzantines find themselves in. The Byzantines were even aiding Venice rivals like Genoa and Pisa at the time. So prior to the Fourth Crusade, we're going to see that Dandolo is going to enact a lot of reforms that are going to go ahead and have impacts domestically and abroad. So one of those reforms is that he expels all of the new foreigners in the city. He stops immigration into the city. And also he takes on some financial reforms that he starts on the year 1194. It's one of the dates that I saw was the most common. And one of the most important ones is that he stabilizes the Venetian currency and he introduces some new coins, the most influential of which was the Venetian grosso. Here we see an image of it. On the left is an image of Jesus Christ, and on the right we see Saint Mark and Dandolo himself. Saint Mark is giving him a banner. So we see a lot of like his own influence being expanded throughout his reign. So we're really going to get into the meat of it now with Dandolo and the Fourth Crusade. So there's some misconceptions that say that Venice was a greedy state that just came into the Crusade late and took advantage of the situation. And this isn't necessarily true. According to Thomas F. Madden and his book Enrico Dandola and the Rise of Venice, there's a lot of correspondence between Pope Innocent III and Dandolo that shows that Venice was always going to be a grand player in the Crusade. But nonetheless, it is true that the Venetians were contracted by the Franks and the Crusaders to transport and supply them throughout the Crusade. They were going to follow Richard the Lionheart's example of taking a maritime route. And they agreed upon a price of 85,000 silver marks. Now, this is about twice the annual revenue of the French crown. And there's a lot of debate saying that Dandolo purposefully overestimated the amount of soldiers that were going to come so that the Venetians can make more money. But we do need to keep in mind that Venice is a maritime power. Their power comes from trade, their navy. They don't really have a lot of experience fielding the army that they're going to transport here. And out of the estimated 35,000 or so troops, only about 10 to 13,000 actually find their way to Venice. The Crusaders are only able to muster up 51,000 marks, and the Venetians are now owed about 34,000 silver marks. And this is not a good position for Dandolo, not a good position for anyone. The Grand Council is angry at them because of the loss that they took. They even suspended trade for about a year. The Crusaders are angry that they're marooned in Venice, that they're not moving. So Dandolo and the Grand Council come to an agreement, and they're going to suspend the Crusaders' debt. But the Venetians also want to have some assurances that they're going to go ahead and get something out of this deal. So an agreement is made, and the Crusaders are going to attack Zara. Now, Zara was under Venetian influence, but they rebelled, and now they're currently under the influence of Hungary. It's another Catholic city, and a lot of Crusaders don't want to do it, but the attack goes on nonetheless, and it's successful. It comes into Venetian influence, and Venice now controls all of the Adriatic coast. But the Pope finds out, excommunicates everyone, then later retracts that, only excommunicates the Venetians and the leaders. It's an entire mess. But shortly after the siege, we find out that the crusading leaders and Dandolo are approached by Alexios IV. Alexios IV is the deposed prince that was, he and his father were deposed by his uncle, Alexios V. So now he comes to the Crusaders and says, if you come and help me take my city back, I will be able to pay you 200,000 marks. There's agreements made, and suddenly the Crusaders find themselves sailing towards Constantinople. So it's another Christian city. And wouldn't you know it, they sack the city. A lot happens before the Crusaders sack the city. They actually tried to take it peacefully. They parade Alexios through the Byzantine town, through Constantinople, but they were met by jeers. And eventually things came to a head, and the Crusaders scaled the wall, sacked the city, and they plundered it. Now, after they plundered the city, there were still debts to be paid, so they ended up taking more treasures from Constantinople, and they ended up taking them back to Venice. So on the next slide over here, we're going to look at some of the treasures that are still in Venice, taken by the Crusaders from the Byzantines. These here are the horses of St. Mark. They are copper gilded statues. They're still in Venice. They decorated the Basilica of St. Mark until they were taken away and stored for restoration. Here we also see on the left, we see marble capitals, which are on top of marble columns taken from Constantinople. On the right is pretty interesting for the Venetians to take this, but this is the Tetrarch, and it is a statue of 4 Roman emperors that dates back to about 300 AD. So we see that they're taking a lot of ancient relics, a lot of things that like really don't have anything else to do, but just that they're valuable, and they're taken back to Venice. Now, the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade is pretty interesting because we see the partitioning of the Byzantine Empire. So this crusade never really makes it into Muslim-held territory, doesn't make it to Jerusalem at all, but we do see that they sack and attack numerous Christian cities. So it's a really interesting crusade. And a lot of historians point to this moment as the moment where the Byzantine Empire just essentially the death blow to it, and say that this is where it never came back from. And it's really interesting because we see in the future, with hindsight, we see that this is a failure of a crusade because it didn't stop the expansion of Islam. It didn't, it failed to do a lot of what the Crusaders set out to do. They never even set foot in the Holy Land. But at the time, it seemed like a victory, not only to Venice, but for Catholicism. The seat of power of the Orthodox Church had been toppled, and in its place, they put on their own kingdoms. Right over here, we see the Latin Empire and the Empire of Nicaea. This is going to be another great player later on before the Byzantine Empire's reform. But as I mentioned, a lot of historians say that the Byzantine Empire never regained its prestige. It was never able to get back to the level that it was. And one question that I have when I'm reading all this is, like I said, a lot of things had to happen before the Crusaders were even at the gates of Constantinople. Historian Jonathan Phillips points out the reason why the Fourth Crusade went to Constantinople in the late spring of 1203 was, ironically, at the invitation of a Greek. The appeal by Prince Alexios to help him and his father secure what they regarded as their rightful position as rulers of the Byzantine Empire. Had this request not been made, there is no convincing evidence that the expedition would have turned towards Constantinople. So one of the reasons why I was saying is that Dandolo was not necessarily a victim of circumstance, but definitely influenced by circumstance, is that this crusade was never meant to go to Constantinople. Historian Christopher Tierman says that in his novel his book God's War, and he says that the Crusaders were presented with no other viable alternative than to sack the city. Like I said, the Venetians were a trading empire. They lost an entire year of trade. The Crusaders themselves were in debt. They had no alternative but to work with what they had. And as far as the point that the Byzantine Empire never regained its prestige, one question I have was that lack of prestige and their death, was it caused by the Fourth Crusade, or was the Fourth Crusade a symptom of something larger that had been plaguing the Byzantine Empire? As we had seen before, their relations with the West weren't necessarily on friendly terms. They had centuries of decline at this point. And as Jonathan Phillips points out, it was an internal affair that led the Crusaders to the Byzantine Empire. So these are all interesting questions to end on. I'm running over the time here, but Enrico Dandolo, definitely an influential figure, not a victim of circumstance, I would say, but definitely influenced by circumstance. And as we see, his decisions continue to influence politics today in the world. So thanks for watching this presentation. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.